The Rules Committee will come to order. We have a busy couple of weeks ahead of us. Hopefully we will get an omnibus bill that we all can agree on that will keep the government running and fund a lot of our important priorities that we all share. We need to get a DOD authorization bill passed. I think the conferees are almost done, although I read today that the president may veto it over an extraneous issue, but we'll see. And then I'm hoping that we can also come to some sort of an agreement on a COVID-19 relief package. You know, we have businesses, restaurants that are struggling. We have families that are, are struggling. We have first responders that need help. We have cities and towns that need help. For the life of me, I don't understand what the holdup is on this. But in any event, but which brings us to today. And I think today is a historic day. Today, the committee is considering H.R. 3884, the MORE Act. This bill will reform the disastrous war on drug laws so that our laws surrounding cannabis are no longer unfairly applied based on the color of your skin. The advancement of this bill is a testament to the many Americans who have pushed Congress to decriminalize cannabis at the federal level for many years now. I'm proud to have worked shoulder to shoulder with them in this fight since my earliest days in Congress. Reforming our nation's policies on cannabis goes hand in hand with addressing systemic racism. Cannabis accounts for over half of all drug arrests in our country, and you're nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis if you're Black in America. In 2018, there were more than 1.6 million drug arrests nationwide. Most of these arrests were tied to possession. These people weren't selling or manufacturing anything. Something is badly broken when those with a tiny amount of cannabis are treated like drug kingpins. The MORE Act will fix this by removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. It finally decriminalizes it at the federal level and allows states to set their own laws on cannabis. And it brings restorative justice to so many Americans while providing resources to those harmed by the war on drugs. Some have wondered why that we are acting on this now. Well, I think it's long past time. And in the words of Martin Luther King, the time is always right to do what is right. So with that, I'm now happy to yield to Mr. Woodall for any opening statement that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I made the pitch on the House floor during our last rule that I thoroughly enjoyed the one veto I'd had a chance to override during my time here in Congress, and perhaps we'll have another opportunity with NDAA between now and the end of the year. I too am glad that we're here today on the MORE Act. I oppose the MORE Act. But if there's one thing we ought to be doing here, it's when state and federal laws collide, when laws become such a subject of disagreement that we fail to enforce them evenly across the board, we're all losers in that scenario. We have an obligation to enforce the federal laws that are on the books today, and if we refuse to enforce those laws, we should repeal those laws. But as you know, this is far from a settled question. I hold letters from folks as diverse as AAA urging us not to take such a dramatic step, to the Surgeon General who would say that the science of brain development is still very much, if not settled in the direction of the very real dangers that this bill may well bring into more of our households across the country. It is easy to talk about these issues at town hall meetings. It is hard to legislate on these issues, and I want to thank the Judiciary Committee and your leadership here at the Rules Committee, Mr. Chairman, for driving this across the floor. I think defeating this bill is going to be a dark spot on the nation. I think refusing to hear this bill is a flaw in our system, and it's one that we as an institution correct today. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks. He yields back. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on HR 3884, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvest and Expungement Act of 2019. We have Representative Jackson Lee and Representative Klein. We're delighted that you are both here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules.documents@mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. At this time, I'm happy to recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Representative Jackson Lee. You have to unmute. Sheila, yeah, okay.
Thought I wasn't that.
There you go. Good.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your courtesies, and thank you to the Rules Committee for their courtesies as well, and the opening statements that have been particularly important and provocative. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of HR 3884, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment Expungement Act of 2020, or the MORE Act of 2020. It is with a great sense of relief that I am supporting this long overdue measure and encourage the rest of my colleagues to do so as well. This is not to promote drug use. It is not to undermine law enforcement, but rather to bring justice to millions of Americans. It has taken a long time to get here, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of those who've made it possible for us to consider this bill today. In particular, my colleague and my chairman on the Judiciary Committee and the author of the bill, Chairman Jerry Nadler. Thank him for his persistence and determination, as well as two other determined colleagues who've been particularly instrumental in getting us here, Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congressman Earl Blumenauer. And I thank the Rules Committee, as said earlier, for its time today in considering this bill so that it may proceed to the floor for House passage. To summarize the provisions of the MORE Act, they fall into three main categories. And I think the Rules Committee and our colleagues on the floor will find these reasonable, thoughtful, and constructive in the line of criminal justice reform, but more importantly, in the line of helping, again, thousands of Americans. First, it would remove marijuana and cannabis from the list or the schedule of federally controlled substances. This means that going forward, individuals could no longer be prosecuted federally for marijuana offenses. This does not mean that marijuana would now be legal in the entire United States, a very important point. It would simply remove the federal government from the business of prosecuting marijuana cases and would leave the question of legality to the individual states. Those states choosing to decriminalize can do so without ongoing interference from the federal government. And those states that choose to continue to make marijuana illegal can continue to do so as well. Second, the bill would set up a taxation structure to collect a sales tax on marijuana, which over the course of 5 years would increase from 5% to 8%. The funds collected through this tax will be used to establish a trust fund to reinvest in communities ravaged by the war on drugs and in communities of color. It has devastated African Americans and, of course, Hispanic community. The trust fund will be used for rehabilitation and reentry programs into the Department of Justice and for programs in the Small Business Administration to ensure that budgeting of the marijuana market is diverse and opens up opportunities for entrepreneurship in communities that have been adversely impacted by the war on drugs. Finally, the bill would expunge and seal federal marijuana convictions and resentence offenders as appropriate, a much needed measure to try to undo the damage that has been done to our communities since marijuana was arbitrarily placed on the list of controlled substances back in 1970. Thousands of men and women, as I previously said, have suffered needlessly from the federal criminalization of marijuana, still burdened today, being prevented from housing, scholarships, college opportunities, jobs, and many others, particularly in communities of color, and have borne, as I said, the burden of collateral consequences for those ensnared in the criminal legal system that have damaged our society across generations. This is unacceptable, and we must change our laws. It is time for Congress to catch up with the reforms that states are enacting. 36 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and Guam have adopted laws allowing legal access to cannabis. 15 states, the District of Columbia and the Northern Mariana Islands, have adopted laws for legalizing cannabis for adult recreational use. a total of 47 states have reformed their laws in one form or another pertaining to cannabis, despite its federal criminalization. The state legal cannabis industry already employs almost 250,000 people, and the federal government needs to get out of the way of state-level decision-making for their citizens. We need to open the door to research, better banking and tax laws, and we need to fuel economic growth in this industry, give opportunities to minorities, and we need to do this without continuing to spend federal resources on criminalization and unjust incarceration for marijuana offenses. We need to pass the MORE Act. Mr. Chairman, you quoted from Dr. Martin Luther King, and I quote again from him, "If not now, then when?" I thank the committee for its time and will be happy to answer any questions you may have. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much for your opening statement. We appreciate it. I would now like to recognize Mr. Klein for his opening statement, and I yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the committee for its indulgence and for allowing me to participate today. I would agree with my colleague from Texas that the states have moved far ahead of the feds on this issue, and it's about time that this conversation moves in earnest forward. Unfortunately, this could have been a bipartisan accomplishment, moving the conversation forward about this issue, advancement on this important issue. Unfortunately,
right? So it is bipartisan.
Ms. Jackson Lee, can you put your microphone on mute? Oh, there you go. Good. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, I testified regarding some budget reforms that I'd like to see occur, and one of the things that I think we should see occur is a return to regular order. So I would hope that we can have not just an omnibus budget, but regular order regarding appropriations in the future, a DoD authorization bill that will not be vetoed, and that we can have another COVID bill that will address some of the challenges of this pandemic are presenting. But with regular order, we also need open rules. And so I would hope that the committee would pass as open a rule as possible regarding this bill so that we can work together to make important changes to the bill. The gentlelady from Texas mentioned my colleague on the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates has an amendment today. He agrees that this bill needs improvement, that it is not 100% solid as it is currently before us. This bill should have been thoroughly analyzed and discussed at length by the Judiciary Committee, also by the Ways and Means Committee, because the tax that's included is a very important one. But instead, it was jammed through committee, and now at the 11th hour, Democrats are attempting to appease the far left by forcing a vote on it. It's a shame that the majority is seemingly unwilling to compromise on this bill. This is an issue that I have worked on for years and have always strived to find balanced solutions whenever possible. As a former member of the Virginia House of Delegates, I sponsored and passed legislation to allow physicians to recommend cannabinoid oil to their patients, create legal dispensaries, and create an affirmative defense for possession of cannabinoid oil for medicinal use. This non-psychoactive derivative can be given in drop form to help people suffering from a variety of debilitating medical conditions. However, due to marijuana's classification at the federal level as a Schedule I drug, we haven't been able to fully study the potential health and therapeutic benefits that may exist due to strict federal limitations on research. Additionally, as states have made changes to their own marijuana laws, conflicting policies from various administrations has placed a burden on law enforcement and on states as they implement these necessary reforms. I think it's important to evaluate the role that the federal government should play when it comes to the regulation of marijuana. In fact, I'm interested in looking at ways to reclassify marijuana to a more appropriate classification on the federal drug schedule. That marijuana should not be at the same level of classification on the federal scale as opioids, as cocaine, and other highly addictive drugs. Members of Congress have diverse views on marijuana policy and on potential reforms. Sadly, this bill ignores the many good ideas out there that could have been incorporated into the final text. As I said, the bill before us would dramatically increase the size of the federal government by creating a new 5% sales tax on marijuana and products, which goes toward 3 new unnecessary and bureaucratic grant programs. This legislation offers expungement of criminal records for those with federal marijuana-related convictions, which sets a dangerous precedent. Wiping the slate clean for folks who committed an offense while said action was illegal does a disservice to the justice system and is unfair to Americans who chose to follow the law. As a former prosecutor, I do not support the expansion of expungement laws that do not involve cases of pure innocence. They create a legal fiction for those defendants who knowingly engaged in criminal behavior. We certainly can't be putting the interests of criminals ahead of the interests of law-abiding American citizens. America does not need this limited and short-sighted legislation. This bill contains several problematic provisions and fails to provide even the most basic safeguards against abuse. In 1995, the THC concentration in commonly cultivated marijuana plants was approximately 4%, a percentage that has increased significantly since that time. Regarding the legalization of marijuana, we need to spend more time considering the impact this bill will have on the American public, and I stand ready to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address concerns and find a viable solution to marijuana reform. I urge my colleagues to vote against this flawed legislation. I would urge the committee to adopt an open rule so that we can debate and perhaps approve additional amendments that will improve the legislation and answer the questions that need to be discussed before taking additional steps. The American people expect and deserve better from us. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the gentleman's opening statement. As I'm looking at the legislative history here, there was a hearing in the Judiciary Committee subcommittee on this issue, and I believe there was also a markup on November 20th, 2019. So, I mean, that's part of regular order. I mean, there's hearings and markups are important. I remember being in the minority and getting lots of bills that had never had a hearing and a markup, but this did. I just say, I mean, what really is disturbing to me is the fact that our marijuana laws have disproportionately harmed individuals and communities of color, despite roughly equal usage rates. I mean, that's a documented fact. Black Americans are nearly 4 times more likely than their white counterparts to be arrested for marijuana possession. And as both of our witnesses know, a marijuana conviction can threaten access to affordable housing. It could threaten access to educational opportunities or the ability to get a job, even the right to vote. So as more and more states continue to modernize their marijuana laws, their cannabis laws, I think it's long past time for Congress to do the same. And that's the way I look at this legislation. But I appreciate the gentleman's and the gentlelady's opening statement. I don't have any questions. I would yield to Mr. Woodall to see if he has questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Klein for his testimony, particularly on issues like this one. We don't always have colleagues who've been working in a partnership way for so very long to try to find a pathway forward. And it hurts me to hear your frustration here that certainly amongst all the other things that you pointed out that we need to be doing, that the American people are counting on us to do. It's not as if folks finally found a partnership path forward and now it's being rushed to the floor. It's that it is being rushed to the floor in the absence of trying to find that partnership path forward. Can you speak a little bit to why that might be? Have you and colleagues like yourself decided to withdraw from this partnership, or what brings us to this place rushing a partisan bill to the floor?
Well, I appreciate that. There are a number of areas related to this legislation that were not discussed. The hearing that we had was not a legislative hearing on this bill. It was a general hearing related to marijuana. There are a number of different issues related to the medical use of marijuana, the recreational use of marijuana, and the building of a federal tax and regulatory structure, and whether that is going to be superior to a state-run, decentralized regulatory process. These are issues that have not been sufficiently debated, whether by the Ways and Means Committee or the Judiciary Committee, and I would hope that we would encourage that discussion before moving forward.
I was looking at the amendments that were offered in committee. I see that the tax rate appears to be lower as a percentage of the cost of the product than the federal tax on beer, than the federal tax on spirits, and the federal tax on cigarettes. I guess my question is, was that a conscious decision the committee made that we're going to not only take this off the schedule today, but we're going to tax it at with what is perhaps the single lowest sin tax that we have on the federal books?
To my knowledge, that was not an issue that was discussed, that was present in the original bill, and we were not able to offer bipartisan input on that issue.
Ms. Jackson-Lee, let me ask you, because I've seen you before this committee advocating on so many different public health issues over the years, advocating successfully, I might add. It surprises me that we're looking at a piece of legislation that does less to protect kids from marijuana than we do to protect kids from cigarettes. That the bill doesn't ban flavored vapes, for example, that would appeal to kids as we have done in tobacco. That does not ban additive and delivery mechanisms for THC, that does not ban the kid-friendly edibles. Again, if we found the partnership and we needed to rush this bill to the floor, I understand it, but it seems particularly odd that we have left out all of these child protection measures that we have all agreed make sense in the context of alcohol, that we've all agreed make sense in the context of tobacco, and yet we're not making them the law of the land as it relates to marijuana. Could you speak to that? Again, given your long history of public health advocacy.
I'm delighted, Mr. Woodall, and thank you for your constructive questioning. Let me also join my colleagues, Mr. Klein, and others, of the importance of a COVID-19 package. I certainly wanted that to be on the record, and of course, a final funding bill for the people of the United States. And as you heard me say, it is a bipartisan bill, but not only for the support of our colleague on judiciary, but in an array of support organizations across America, and I'll share that with you at a later point. But the point that I think is important, answering your question, yes, I have a great concern for health, and we have been on the floor together, and a great concern for justice. And so to answer your question, first of all, this bill deals with decriminalizing at a federal level for possession and distribution. Those simple points. Secondarily, we do not diminish the responsibilities of states or other regulatory agencies, such as the Food and Drug Regulatory Agency as relates to vaporing. Those laws stand strong, and I support them. Third, we have basic laws in terms of this particular decriminalizing, adhering to state law of not selling to anyone under age 21, or not providing any legal cover for people who would sell to those under age 21. We're concerned about young people. Medically, one of our colleagues, it might have been you, it said about science and brain science, and I know that maturity does not come in terms of your brain being fully matured until ages 24, 25. This does not negate any medical oversight through states, through different agencies, through, for example, the veterans hospitals, where veterans have wanted to come and get medically documented marijuana and cannabis, and they could not do it because the doctors were afraid that it was federally illegal. We open the doors to justice for a wide range, but we protect children. We're not supporters of vaporing. Those state laws remain. And certainly is an opportunity to do a federal vaporing bill. I've seen members of Congress be really adamant. I think I've co-sponsored legislation. I'm looking at former Secretary Shalala. But as I conclude, let me be clear that we wanted to bring justice to thousands who have been incarcerated and have been shut out from basic dignity of housing, scholarships, and others. And I think we've answered it in this bill. And I think we've answered your questions as well of our concern about making sure our children are safe.
Well, I very much appreciate that response. I would feel better if we could have that discussion on the floor, if we could have the conversation about whether it is at the federal level or the state level that we should be banning edibles, whether it is at the federal level or the state level where we should be banning flavors. Again, these are conversations that we've had it in the alcohol context, had it in the tobacco context. As I look, Mr. Chairman, at the list of the amendments that have been offered, it is a fairly short list. I know we have floor time available this week. Even if we, in our wisdom as a committee, decided to have a pre-printing requirement so that all members could have their thoughts understood before they came to the floor of the House, I would hope that we could do as Mr. Klein has suggested and make more voices available on this bill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Is Ms. Torres? I'm not sure if she's with us or not.
I have no comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Ms. Lesko with us? We'll come back to her if she comes on. I'll go to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation, and Ms. Jackson-Lee, thank you for testifying on behalf of this legislation. I think you've summarized it very well. It really is designed to eliminate decades of bad law and decades of discrimination. It was arbitrarily, the cannabis laws were arbitrarily added to our statutes back in 1970 without any study, without any real effort to determine whether there were benefits or detriments or whatever. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people have been incarcerated ever since. And Mr. Klein, I appreciate your position as a prosecutor, and you said you've worked on cannabis legislation when you were in the Virginia legislature, and I thank you for that. And I appreciate, I know, I carried the legislation on the Safe Banking Act to try to at least align those states and their marijuana laws and their banking laws so that the banking system, the financial system could manage this stuff, because it's happening whether you as a prosecutor or me as a legislator want it or not. It's happening, and we've got to deal with that. So I don't know whether in your work as a legislator, if you worked on sort of the banking side of the cannabis matters or not, but that needs to be resolved. But the bigger question is this one, the MORE Act, dealing with decriminalizing it, and in my estimation, expunging the records of so many people who, had violations that were de minimis, but have ruined their reputations and their abilities to do many things. I mean, you can't disagree with that, Mr. Klein, can you?
No, Congressman, I do not. I agree with your concerns regarding the disparities that have developed, a lot of the history that is involved there. I am concerned that we should be able to make improvements to the law moving forward, whether it's opening it up for medicinal use, opening it up for use by veterans. There are a lot of different reforms. That's why I would like to see an open rule here to debate those reforms, to allow states to continue to innovate while still keeping in mind that we can't eliminate the past. We can't simply say that the past no longer is past, and that criminal activity that did happen that may have involved marijuana, and you have very serious criminal related offenses that may have occurred that would be expunged under this law. Yes, there would be a kingpin exception, but there would still be a large number of criminal offenses that would be expunged as a result of this legislation. And so
let me reclaim my time, because in Colorado, our prosecutors are beginning to and have started expunging people's records. because of the decision by our law enforcement community, especially our prosecutors, that this law and local laws have been wrong for a long time. So I appreciate you're not wanting to get rid of the past, and we're not getting rid of the past, but we're getting rid of violations that were probably inappropriate at the time they were given to individuals, and we're making up for that. And in so many ways, they were dispensed in a discriminatory fashion. And I think that is one of the reasons that we're doing this broader brush. And I appreciate your concern that we could be more specific and it could be more tailored. But I think this thing has been bad for so long, we got to fix it in a big way. And I just appreciate the legislation. And I appreciate what you've said and Mr. Woodall has said. But I think we're past that time, and we need to get on with correcting an injustice that's been around for 50 years now. So with that, I yield back to the chair.
Chairman, may I comment?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
thank Congressman Perlmutter for his leadership and also Colorado's leadership, and to my good friend from the Judiciary Committee. First of all, the bill is thoughtful. It deals with the expungement of marijuana cases, if you will, in possession and distribution. The other thing is that I wanted to make sure that we didn't leave the vaping issue without response. Most of the vaping deaths in children come from an unregulated market using cartridges or nicotine, and that has been responded to by states. When you have a regulated market, you decrease the both the desire and access for children, and we are very keen on that. We didn't leave a gaping hole. This bill is narrowly drawn, rightly so, to ensure that on the federal level we decriminalize the offense of marijuana. States have been for years addressing these questions, and we know when marijuana is illegal, children go to other things as well. I think it's important to note that the Ways and Means Committee actively worked on the tax structure, and we are very grateful to them for doing that. And likewise, I know that as we were working on this, and many of us who've been dealing with this for years have known that we have somewhat eased the banking problem, which means that if it's not a federal offense, banks can be more apt to work with small businesses and others in a normal banking situation, which makes it safer for others. This past week, I lost a ex-football player. His family is still mourning, so I will leave my facts very narrow, but large amounts of marijuana were found because it was assumed, we don't have all the facts, that he might have been engaged in that. We don't condemn that at all in light of what marijuana is. What we say is we don't want to have continued loss of life, and loss of life as well as a loss of future. And this bill helps us not to have a loss of future in large populations of African Americans and other minorities.
And I thank the gentlelady, and I want to just say the addition of the funding piece to this, I think is very, very important, both from the cannabis industry side of it, as well as the ability to help correct some of the things that have occurred over these many years. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I would yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am also a proud co-sponsor of this legislation. And when I was a state senator in Maryland, I introduced legislation to provide for a medical cannabis program in the state of Maryland, and also to decriminalize marijuana in our state. And I feel very strongly that this legislation moves us in the right direction. I want to commend Ms. Jackson Lee and also our colleague, Mr. Perlmutter, for their leadership on these issues. The war on drugs as it pertains to marijuana has really been a war on our own people. And tens of thousands of mostly young people, have been caught up in the war on drugs and have had their futures ruined by virtue of having criminal convictions related to marijuana on their records, on their resumes, and so on. It's tough enough to find a job in America today with record levels of unemployment during COVID-19 without a drug conviction on your record. But if you've got a marijuana conviction on your record, and the majority of drug convictions are marijuana related, it becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find a job. And I say that as somebody who I don't use even alcohol. I'm a teetotaler. I understand where the prohibitionists were coming from. I'm very vigilant in pursuing an anti-drug perspective with my own children and other kids in our family and other kids I talk to about it. But I think that our experience with prohibition demonstrates why drug prohibition has failed. And, we amended the Constitution in 1920 in the 18th Amendment to criminalize traffic in liquor. And then we had to undo that in the 21st Amendment in 1933 because it was such a disaster. All we succeeded in doing was driving up the price of liquor, building organized crime, enriching the alcohol bootlegger underworld. And it's basically been the same story with the war on drugs and certainly marijuana. And, it is conservative economists who are blowing the whistle on this a long time ago, which is why William F. Buckley and the Cato Institute have been championing the cause of decriminalization and legalization of marijuana for a long time. All we've succeeded in doing is building up the power of the drug syndicates, the traffickers all over the world, enriching them without advancing the public health in any way. So I hope that this puts us on a rational course so we can deal with abuse problems from a public health perspective. We can end the war on our own people, and that is a war that has disproportionately affected minority communities and young people. We can move to promote public health in ways that actually work. So I'm proud we're doing this. It would be great if our colleagues across the aisle could join us in doing this. I do think it's something of general bipartisan common good application, and I think everybody should think real hard about joining this. It's a great opportunity for us to have a breakthrough, and I just want to thank Ms. Jackson-Lee for her leadership, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon.
Yes, thank you. Like my colleagues, I too am a co-sponsor of this bill and do look forward to its passage. I mean, my colleagues have spoken quite eloquently about the disparate impact that the current law has had upon communities of color and young people. But I also hail from Pennsylvania, where we're one of the states that is decriminalizing marijuana at this point. It's been approved for medical use. Certainly the area that I represent, just in the past week or 2 weeks, we've seen our local agencies decide that they're no longer going to prosecute small amounts of marijuana. So, as a matter of representation, it becomes a priority to enable my state, my localities to move forward and move into the 21st century in terms of how we're going to treat marijuana federally. So with that, I'd yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, am a co-sponsor of this bill. And like Mr. Raskin, when I was in the New York State Legislature, we took, I think, the appropriate step of creating medicinal marijuana, the so-called, because of Schedule I, though, it was, relatively hard to have. I think we called it, well, I won't get into what we called it, being able to get seeds for marijuana when you couldn't take it over state lines because of the Schedule I prohibition. And when you look at the other things that are on Schedule I, Oxycontin and cocaine and some of the other drugs, which certainly seem more appropriate for Schedule I, marijuana does not, and cannabis does not. So I think The points have been made by my colleagues very eloquently. I think this is appropriate. It's long overdue, and I'm disappointed we didn't get more bipartisan support. I think we certainly should, and I think this is let the states do what they think is appropriate relative to legalization of recreational marijuana, medicinal marijuana, et cetera. But it seems to me that we're far past the time when we should be doing this. And clearly, when you look at the systemic racism and the impacts of communities of color in the disproportionate way that these laws have been applied over the years, this calls for, demands for action immediately. So I am strongly in favor of the bill and look forward to.
Ms.
Yes,
Morelli?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
May I add to your very astute comments? I think it's important to reinforce the fact that expungement is court supervised, and that's an important for prosecutors to know. This is not self-germinating. The other thing is the important point of restorative justice, which includes those funds will be used to help those who are addicted or substance abusers, which can come about in many instances, as my good friend Congressman Raskin said about our mistake in making alcohol illegal, but it created, not created, but we certainly have people addicted to alcohol. But this actually will provide resources to help in those who have been over-criminalized, help in community outreach, and I think that is extremely important. And our veterans, we've just gotten through with our immediate wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, and certainly there are conflicts and incidences around the world where veterans or soldiers who then become veterans need this medicinally. And doctors at our many, many veterans hospitals and probably military installations were fearful or did not prescribe this for veterans who were in need. We now give them that ability. We have to recognize that we should not be saying no to our veterans on legitimate medical assistance, and this legislation thoughtfully allows them to be served.
Well, I appreciate. Yeah, no, I appreciate, Ms. Jackson Lee, I appreciate very much all those points, which are very well taken and very important. And you said something earlier, which again, we should stress, which is what this bill is not. This is not legalizing cannabis around the country. That's the decision that individual states will make and whatever is appropriate for them, given their attitudes towards it. But it certainly seems to me the federal government should remove barriers for the states to do what they feel is appropriate. So again, thank you for your leadership in this. Thank you, Ms. Chairman, for not only putting the bill on our agenda, but also for your leadership as well. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me repeat a couple of points that people have made and then make another point. Marijuana is now legal for adult use in 15 states. It's legal for medical use in 36 states. My own home state of Florida voted to legalize medical marijuana in 2016. It's easy to think of the criminalization of marijuana purely as a matter of justice, and make no mistake about it, the war on drugs has disproportionately impacted communities of color. As you have pointed out, Mr. Chairman, while white Americans and Americans of color use marijuana at roughly equal rates, Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. Our drug laws are unjust. They should be changed. I clearly support this bill. They have clearly done more harm than good. But that does not mean that marijuana use is risk-free. For decades, I've spoken out about the need for more research into cannabis. I actually ran the legal marijuana farm in Oxford, Mississippi when I was Secretary of HHS. I may be the only person here who's ever had a farm under their jurisdiction that grew marijuana. We need more research into cannabis, its uses in medicine, and the dangers it poses to our health we know very little about. While marijuana has the potential to help people in some conditions, including epilepsy and MS, and we used it during the great AIDS crisis to give people back their appetites. Healthcare providers are too often flying blind, unsure of the dosage that they should prescribe or whether they should send their patients to pick up and where they should send their patients to pick up medically safe cannabis. We also need more research into marijuana because no matter how many states pass ballot measures to decriminalize cannabis, marijuana is still a drug. We don't entirely know how severely it impairs people and what sorts of long-term effects it can have on our health, because criminalization at the federal level has prevented researchers from pursuing these studies. In the 1990s, even when we made millions of dollars available for researchers, they had so much trouble actually applying for those grants and getting access to marijuana for research purposes because of the criminal laws at the federal level. The over-criminalization of Black and brown Americans for minor drug use is a disgrace, and we can and must fix our own drug laws to combat systemic racism and mass incarceration. But we also need to remember that this should not be the end of our work on cannabis policy. If cannabis becomes legal across the country tomorrow, millions of people who are incarcerated for marijuana use would possibly get their lives back. And this would be a great thing, but we would still need a federal investment in marijuana research so we can determine how it should be used medically and if any regulations would be appropriate to protect the public health and safety. Right now, we just don't know. So my question for my friend, Ms. Jackson Lee, who's provided superb leadership on this, is how will the MORE Act help us with research into the risks and benefits of cannabis?
First of all, Madam Secretary, Madam Congresswoman, thank you so very much for, I think, a very valid point that even in the Judiciary Committee was thoughtfully considered, and that is that we recognize what cannabis and marijuana both are. They're drugs. We believe that the decriminalizing at the federal level will open the doors to researchers, to research grants, to the very question that you've raised, the very question that you were supervising with that farm in Mississippi, if I believe. We are not in any way unmindful that we have a long way to go. What we wanted to do with the MORE Act, and I really think it's narrowly constructed, and if we look at the numbers of Americans that support making marijuana legal, if you will, it is a majority of both Democrats and Republicans. But that does not say that they're not concerned about research dealing with brain impact, research, as you've indicated, of addictiveness or addiction, and of course, long-term impacts, particularly on lungs that may be impacted. So my answer to you is, this is a component in progress. This is a component under the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee. We think other committees, now if this is ultimately passed and signed by the president, will have the opportunity to take the next steps on research. We'll now be able to have the researchers in our research institutions across America very uninhibited to apply for grants that would allow them to do this research nationally. And I just want to finish on this point, the restorative justice part of it, even though it deals specifically with trying to correct the ills that happen to the large segments of the minority population. This is going back to the 1970s. People need to understand that these men and women are still carrying that felony conviction. They could be out, but they're still denied benefits. If they wanted to go to college at age 45, they're still denied benefits. But in it, it also has a provision, as I said, on substance abuse. That's a large area of research that needs to be attended to that can help across the board on addiction questions. So, Congressman, I hope that answered your question. We think if we take this barrier away, it'll open the doors to massive research that should go on.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Yeah, Mr. Klein, you may, yeah.
Thank you. Just briefly, I think you would get consensus and you would make this more bipartisan if you enabled that research to go on and make it available to individuals in our veterans communities and others, and study it under a more limited scope than this bill is proposing. This bill, for research purposes, puts the cart before the horse. It removes it from the schedule altogether, and then allows for research to proceed. We would argue that the research could best be done under a rescheduling, and then we can discuss the benefits and whether removing it from the schedule altogether is appropriate, because we all agree that it doesn't belong in the same place on the schedule as cocaine, as heroin, as these other types of heavily addictive drugs. I think you would get much more of a bipartisan support for the measure if you went in that direction. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Matsui.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses here today, and I want to thank them for all their work on this issue that's been around for a very long time. I just want to say that the current discrepancy between the federal and state law regarding the criminalization of marijuana has, we all know, serious implications for racial justice, affordable housing, job opportunities, and it also creates barriers for those doing important work to study the health effects, public safety, and environmental impacts of marijuana. At the University of California, researchers are doing important work examining the chemical properties of a marijuana being sold and consumed in many states. However, despite the fact that cannabis is being cultivated right in California to sell at local dispensaries, under current law, UC researchers must obtain their study samples through the contracted site in Mississippi. We all know this research could yield important breakthroughs and provide really critical information on the local public health effects of cannabis, but it really is being stymied by our muddled legal framework. We have been discussing it for such a long time. The MORE Act will also take crucial steps to help right the disproportionate effect marijuana laws have had on individuals and communities of color by establishing 3 grant programs to create new opportunities for individuals with prior convictions as they work to advance their careers, education, and overall quality of life. I must say that I think a lot of people have been brought a long ways regarding marijuana, and I think it's important now to take this next step. Otherwise, we're going to be stymied here. There are many important benefits of marijuana research that we need to examine, and I also believe unless we go further into it, look at the social injustices because of its status as it is today, we really must move forward. So I look forward to supporting this bill on the floor later this week. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Woodall, is there anybody else on your side that we're missing? I'm looking at my screen here. I don't see anybody else.
Mr. Chairman, I believe all voices have been heard.
Mr.
Mr.
I'm sorry,
Morrow?
this is, yeah, do you mind, may I ask one other question?
Sure.
I apologize I should have thought of this, but it was in response to actually what Mr. Klein just said. As I understand, I just want to make sure I understand his point. We're talking about the criminality and removing criminal penalties and restorative justice. I'm not sure I understand your point that somehow doing research after we pass this bill isn't of value. The research would be, as I understood it from Secretary Shalala, and I share her concerns, but what the health impacts are, similar to doing research on tobacco that allowed us to ultimately make the decision to put warnings on cigarettes or warnings on alcohol as it relates to pregnant women and the impact, et cetera. So I don't understand. Why wouldn't we take the step now of addressing the criminal issues, the restorative justice issues, and doing research on the health effects, which would have nothing to do with the criminality and removing it from Schedule 1? I just want to make sure I understood you. From my perspective, there's no conflict here in doing it in this order. Did you mean something different than that? Did I misunderstand you?
No, Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for his question, and I'd say the only difference is that a rescheduling and enabling of prescriptive authority for physicians while still maintaining a federal limitation on possession would enable that research, but not simply conduct the research after it's been decriminalized and removed from the federal schedule altogether. It's just a more, it's just a process by which it would be more gradual instead of all at once.
This does, I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but this has an enormous impact on the lives of people who have been put in the criminal justice system, who are disadvantaged. There has been a disproportionate application of the law, which is ruining lives. I share the people who have spoken, Secretary Shalala and others, Ms. Jackson Lee, about the health impacts that marijuana may have on people, your cardiopulmonary system, the impacts may be similar to tobacco, all those things. But notwithstanding that, it doesn't seem to me to be in conflict at all with the question of whether or not it should be on Schedule 1. I just wanted to make it clear, because I'm certainly sympathetic to the notion that we have to do more research on the health impacts to individuals, maybe fetal development, maybe other things that we don't know about. It seems to me that the Schedule 1 placement prohibits or inhibits the ability to do that research, but these are separate issues in my mind. One is about justice and criminality. One is about health impacts or research on the properties. So I don't see them in conflict. But I just wanted to clarify that so that I wasn't missing a point that you were making. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you for indulging me.
Mr. Chairman.
Who's
Chairman?
Who's that? Mr. Jackson?
Yeah. Yes. Mr. Chairman, am I recognized?
Yes.
Thank you so very much. Gentleman from New York is very much in line with the very constructive and narrow drawing of this legislation. And I want to say to Mr. Klein, I started out by saying that this is not legislation to undermine law enforcement overall. That includes prosecutors and various levels of law enforcement across America. The rescheduling, I'd have to oppose that concept, because if the bill passed on rescheduling, the only beneficiaries would be industry and businesses, because the criminal aspects of the impact against those who would be subject to the law would still be there. They would still have the burden, the brunt. They still lose all of their future benefits, their life, their future. They would still be criminals. They would still be what we created in 1970, which is a tsunami of young men and women coming out of inner city America, having no future for standing on a corner with a little bit of marijuana. I saw it in my neighborhoods. I lived it. You wondered where Jerry went or Mary went, and where they went was under a criminal offense federally, prosecuted at 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds. So I think the idea of rescheduling was something we looked at, but frankly, we don't believe that it undermines the ability for law enforcement to ensure that other aspects of drugs are not taken care of. Again, this is distribution and possession, and it doesn't eliminate state actions. The other point I wanted to make is that it's been scientifically proven that marijuana is not a gateway drug. There's ample scientific evidence demonstrating that the use of marijuana does not cause the use of other substances. And according to the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, the majority of people who use marijuana do not go on to use other drugs. Again, with research, as this bill may pass, and the unleashing of restraints for researchers to get federal grants, we can see more, but there is no evidence of that. The other point that I think is extremely important is that the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics have said that recreational marijuana laws were associated with an 8% decrease in the odds of marijuana use and a 9% decrease in the odds of frequent marijuana use. Consistent with the results of previous researches, there's no evidence that the legalization of medical marijuana encourages marijuana use among youth. Moreover, the estimates reported showed that marijuana use among youth may actually decline after legalization or recreational purposes. What I can tell you in my neighborhood, it will diminish the deaths, the killing of small timers dealing with marijuana sales and losing their life. If I can get that window of life-saving opportunity I'm willing to take it. And then when I look at my 45-year-old, 50-year-old, 60-year-old mothers and fathers and grandparents who have felonies because of what they did when they were 19, and they are people of color with other burdens on them. Low education, why? Because the door was closed to them as they could have been in college, typically somewhere, and they never went back. So I'm hoping that my colleagues will join us in passing and supporting in the Rules Committee this bipartisan legislation, because we tried to look at every aspect to ensure that we were not diminishing the legal infrastructure that would be protective, i.e. states, but also responded to the 47 states who have some aspect of decriminalizing marijuana. We think we have done that. We're glad that it was bipartisan. We look forward to being able to open this to the American people so that we can do the right thing and that we can work together, not only to look back for the expungement controlled by courts, but to look forward and to be able to have a just legal system. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kindness.
Thank you very much. I want to, let me just say, Ms. Jackson Lee, I want to associate myself with your remarks and that of my colleague, Mr. Morelli, and a lot of the others on this panel. Look, when people ask me, like, what is systemic racism? I point to our drug laws in this country and how they have been enforced disproportionately and negatively impacting communities of color. That's a statistical fact. And as has been pointed out, I mean, people's lives have been ruined, have been destroyed by possessing just a small amount of cannabis. And it's just wrong. And, maybe this bill isn't perfect, but I've never seen a perfect piece of legislation in my lifetime. But it seems to me that the focus of this bill is to try to create fairer and more just laws, and to also address the unjust enforcement of some of our drug laws in the past. I mean, to give people back their lives. And so I think we ought to move forward on this, and I hope that we do. But obviously, there's a lot more work that we need to deal with in the future. But I want to thank Mr. Klein and Ms. Jackson Lee for your participation, and you are now free to go. And we have one other panel here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to now welcome the Honorable Earl Blumenauer of Oregon. Earl, were you with us? Thank you for providing your testimony today. Any written that you could submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be without objection entered into the record. So I now recognize Mr. Blumenauer. And you got to turn your video on.
I'm trying. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Where are you? Okay. There you are. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I deeply appreciate the conversation that's taken place, and I strongly associate myself with the comments that several of you have made. I think you've outlined, Mr. Chairman, what the situation is. Jackson Lee's was spot on. Ed Perlmutter's tireless efforts, starting with the banking bill. This is part of, I think, the culmination of what I've seen in the last 12 years in Congress, where the pieces are coming together. It is not any threat at all to what's going on at the states. To the contrary, the states will be able to do what they want to do without federal interference. We just had, at the last election day, the most important polls in Mississippi, in Montana, in South Dakota, Arizona, where voters, again, took this into their own hands. We have seen now 99% of the American public has legal access to some form of legalized cannabis. The the manifest harms that has been documented weigh on my heart. This is an opportunity for this Congress to move in the right direction, to listen to those concerns, and to allow the states to move forward. Absolutely, there's more work to be done, but this bill is a critical first step. I could not be more proud of the work that the Judiciary Committee. They were extraordinarily cooperative and our being able to work with them. I've been involved with the legislation for years. This is the best piece that I have seen. It sweeps away the cobwebs in terms of the research. I really appreciate Mr. Morelli's talking about clarifying what our friend's concern was about research. There's no reason that we should not be able to move forward. We are ceding the innovation in this industry to Israel and to Canada. It's outrageous that parents in my community and in yours who have little babies who are subject to extreme seizure disorders, that they have to do their own pharmacological research to be able to fashion medicine for their children. And we don't have a framework to have that move forward. The one plantation that was referenced by Congresswoman Shalala is not the quality of cannabis that we see in Congresswoman Matsui's state of California that would be able to provide benefits. We have it in Oregon. It's outmoded, it's narrow, and it's stupid. This is an opportunity for the federal government to get in step with what has happened in states across the country. The legislation is carefully balanced. There are, I will tell you, any number of interest groups that are been a part of these conversations. There's a delicate balancing in terms of social justice, in terms of the industry, in terms of state regulators. And I think that was hit very well by the Judiciary Committee. The tax is something that we've done on the Ways and Means Committee, and the decision was made to keep it relatively low, not dealing with tobacco or alcohol, which are fully legal substances, and where we're not dealing with vast black markets. Having a relatively low tax is an important step to be able to deal with illicit activities that actually poses a threat to our children. There is no corner drug dealer that checks for identification before he or she sells to a junior high student. They have no license to lose. When we legalize, regulate, and tax, we be able to bring it under the tent. We have an opportunity to clear up these ambiguities. We have an opportunities for states to continue to experiment and refine their efforts. And we are speaking directly to the people who've demanded action. And I don't know what clearer signals we could get than what has happened in state after state, where the voters have taken it in their hands, what's happened in terms of legislatures that are extremely conservative, who understand this is what the voters want. And Congresswoman Shalala's state of Florida, that was over 60% of the people that approved medical marijuana. This is an opportunity for the federal government to get in step, to be a constructive partner, to be able to move forward with reform, to protect our children by taxing, regulating, and being able to be in partnership with the states. I'll resist the temptation to go on and on. I am happy to respond to any questions that you may have. I think it's safe to say that I've been working on this issue longer than any other politician in America. I started in 1973 when Oregon was the first state to decriminalize. I've been campaigning on this literally from Bangor, Maine to Santa Barbara, California, working with a number of you on these provisions. I'm excited that we've reached this point And I think it's an opportunity for the federal government to be a full partner that the states deserve. I would urge you to move the legislation forward. I've examined the amendments. There's nothing there that's new that wasn't considered by the Judiciary Committee or those of us that's worked on it. I would say that there has been significant bipartisan participation in terms of refining this bill. What happened with the Safe Banking Act, what's happened, we have a bipartisan research bill with Congressman Harris and I that's ready to move forward. But this bill is an important step. I would respectfully request that you move it forward and not encumber it with other amendments that aren't going to add to the discussion and really are not necessary for the federal partnership to move forward.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman for his testimony, and I also want to commend him on his leadership on this issue. And he's right; he's been working on this for a long time, and he's been ahead of not only most members of Congress, but most states, in fact, when it's come to dealing with this issue. But I also just want to point out a point that the gentleman made, which I think is worth emphasizing. This is not a new concept. The bill that we're moving forward here. It was marked up over a year ago. So it's been around for a long time. We are finally now bringing it to the floor for a vote. I think it's long overdue, but we need to move forward. But anyway, I thank the gentleman for his leadership. I'd like to yield now to Mr. Woodall for any questions or comments.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Ms. Torres.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter.
Just want to say thank you to Mr. Blumenauer for his decades of work on this. And, this bill really addresses a lot of things, and a lot of things that should have been changed ages ago. So just want to say thanks for your tireless work, and it really has been tireless, and you've been focused, and hopefully we can get the Senate to get off their duff and take something up. I mean, they are scared of their shadows on this thing, or at least their leadership is, because there is bipartisan support for advancing our marijuana laws in the Senate if their leadership would ever take anything up, which is pretty frustrating because America is so far ahead of this Congress on this subject, it's ridiculous. So, Earl, thank you for your work on this. I yield back.
All right, thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, I too just want to salute Mr. Blumenauer for his great leadership in changing both sentiment within Congress, but also public opinion. And we are definitely catching up now with where the public is and where the states are. And so I want to thank him for his hard work, and I yield back to you.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Nothing from me. Thank you.
Mr. Morelli.
Yeah, no, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank Mr. Blumenauer for his extraordinary leadership over the many years, and grateful to him for his work.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Shalala.
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Matsui.
I have no questions. I just want to say thank you to Mr. Blumenauer. I know he's been there for a long time, and we really appreciate your leadership. And I do hope that we can move this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Woodall, is there anybody I'm missing?
You are not, Chair.
Okay, all right. No other questions? I want to thank Mr. Blumenauer for.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
If I could just say, I can't tell you how much I appreciated listening to the entire proceedings of the Rules Committee. And I would just wish that our colleagues had a chance to hear what you were saying and have done. I think that would be extraordinarily helpful for them. I think your hearing really covered the waterfront on the issue as well as anything that and I appreciate what the committee did in putting it together.
Well, I appreciate that, and my hope is we could have a thoughtful debate on the House floor, not only on the rule, but on the bill itself. So thank you very much. Let me just maybe, are there any members who, so you're dismissed, Mr. Blumenauer. Thank you. Are there any other members who wish to testify in HR 3884? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on HR 3884. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the.
You need to turn your video on. There you go. Perfect. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant HR 3884, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act of 2019, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee print 116-67 modified by the amendment printed in the Rules Committee report shall be considered and adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You heard the motion from the gentleman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Woodall.
I noted your interest in having a thoughtful discussion on the House floor, and so I would like to make a motion that we have an open rule so that we can have such a thoughtful discussion on the House floor. I note that there weren't but 5 amendments submitted. 3 of those were Republican amendments. The opportunity to have a full-throated discussion certainly is not going to be available to us on NDAA. It's not going to be available to us on a continuing resolution, but it is available to us on something that is very narrow in scope, as this bill is, and one that does cross some of our very traditional partisan lines, and I think deserves that kind of conversation. I had hoped we would have more than just the manager's amendment made in order, but because there were such a limited number of amendments offered, I make the motion that we make this an open rule.
You heard the amendment from the gentleman from Georgia. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. The chair, the noes have it.
I have taken an informal poll here in the committee room, Mr. Chairman. I do not need a roll call vote to confirm it.
Thank you. Any other amendments? Hearing none. The question is now on the motion offered from the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And I will handle this for Democrats.
And while I suspect there are others who wanted to do this for Republicans, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to seize the power that I have and nominate myself to handle this as for Republicans.
Well, we look forward to seeing you on the floor. Without any objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you all very much.